Okay, good morning. This video is going to be about part one of the neurologic system, um, which is in regards to Unit 4. And I won't go over every slide in the presentation, I never do, but I want to emphasize a few major points. And I think that this unit is another good unit, kind of a simple unit to understand. Maybe remembering everything is a bit harder, but understanding the conditions here and applying the principles that we've talked about in the first week in the introduction as well, and you'll see that these ideas are reoccurring. There's always the same mechanisms that somehow happen, and I'm trying to emphasize that in every presentation, and I hope it's coming across. And if not, just let me know and I'll emphasize it even more. So yeah, we're gonna go over the things, and I'm gonna emphasize a few points, and I'll let you know exactly in what slides. And some slides I'm just gonna, skip over because I think the information there is kind of simple, and if you understand the principles first, you should not have a problem understanding the mechanisms. So I'm just going to go to slide number 11 because the first ones are kind of, general informations, right? So I want to remind you, and you should know that this is basic, this is not advanced knowledge. There's a hierarchy, a very defined hierarchy within the nervous system between the higher nervous system, or what we call the central nervous system, and the peripheral. And that distinction and division between the two will, come up again and again in every book, in the articles that you read, and the explanations. It is regarded as anything within the spinal cord, and above towards the brain itself, and the brain itself, of course, are higher centers of the nervous system, and they are usually they have different responsibilities, and they are the decision makers. So information flows into them, they interpret the information, and they make decisions, and then they send the orders of what to do. Whereas the peripheral nervous system is more about sensing the information and conducting it, back and forth between the organ or the source of the input, the data, and the brains or the centers. Okay, then if you go to slide number 12, I want you to notice the second point, which is the one that I want to emphasize, and I wrote like this: remember, meaning you should know this, any situation, exercise, and process that depletes glucose, meaning that lowers the level of glucose available, is challenging the nervous system. Not a good idea. What do I mean by that? You have to understand that the nervous system is running mainly on glucose. Okay? So when you deplete glucose for any reason, you are slowly putting this system to a challenge. And when you put the nervous system to a challenge, when you challenge it, you're asking for it. So of course, at low decreased levels of glucose depletion, you still don't have a problem. But at higher levels, you're definitely going to have a problem. Okay, then we can go to slide 14 that relates to nerve injury. And notice this very first point on slide number 14. I want you to stop and not just read it, but understand it. And not just understand it, don't take it for granted. Understand the deeper meanings of what's written here. And I'm going to read it. The mature nerve cell does not divide. Thus, injury may bear a permanent loss of function. What does this mean? When a cell cannot divide, it cannot regenerate. Meaning that if you get to the point where injury has inflicted such such a damage or such damage to a nervous cell, a nerve cell, that it can no longer divide and it can no longer regenerate, you're looking at permanent or chronic implications. So that's very, very important. Then just beneath it, in the same slide, you can see at the fourth row where it says shrinking of the myelin sheet. Here's the thing. Why is that so important? I hope you remember the function and the responsibilities and the properties of the myelin sheet. It influences conductance, and it's also a physical barrier that helps the immune system. So in a way, it's part of, you can look at it as a physical barrier or a mechanical barrier, meaning that it's part of the innate immune system, or it's serving the innate immune system. When the myelin sheet or coverage is damaged, decreased, for any kind of reason, you're going to have problems with the conductance of the nervous system. And remember that, because we're going to see that happening again and again and again. Okay, so don't forget that phrase and that term. And then you can see that when you have some kind of disintegration, damage, you have a very specific sign, which is the Schwann cells aligning in column rather than in a row. And that, of course, cannot be seen with the eye, but under a microscope or other equipment or tools, you can definitely see that. Okay. Now you can analyze the location of the damage, because when they align in column, it's going to be between the effector and the organ that is going to be affected. So you understand, it kind of locates for you where the damage is done. Okay, then I want to talk, let's go to slide number 16. I think that slide number 15 is pretty simple to understand. And the third point is talking about crushing injuries versus cutting injuries. Crushing is way easier, or I should be accurate and say relatively easier to heal versus cutting injuries. When you have a cut, because these cells do not regenerate and do not divide, it's it's a way worse impact on the system than a crushing injury. When you cut something, it's going to be replaced at the point of the cut with scarring tissue, and scarring tissue is not a healing tissue, and it can also have mechanical implications. So I want you to remember that. And then I want to look at slide 17 at the title itself. Let's talk about the title itself. The title says pain, temperature, sleep, and sensory function. A few points come to mind, okay? How does the nervous system sense? In order to understand some of the conditions we're going to talk about, you have to understand that parts of the system start as receiving input, which is absolute, and with time the measurements or the information or the interpretation of the information depends on the relativity of the inputs. For example, let's say you're in the shower, and at first the water is hot, right? And you feel that the water is hot. And although the water's temperature does not change with time necessarily, it's not becoming colder or hotter, you feel accustomed to the heat. That's because the difference is the heat gradient. between two sampling times of the nervous system has become either zero or decreased. So you have to remember that we're going to have deficits, we're going to have conditions that same principle is going to affect. When we're talking about temperature, we're talking about heat. Basically, anything that can influence heat, create loss or generation of heat, is going to affect the body. In addition, don't forget that temperature also affects chemical reactions and can lead to the deformation or the lack of formation, loss of formation, of certain molecules, such as enzymes. So this can have a very serious implication on function. And then when we're talking about function itself, remember that function depends on many processes. One of the major ones is regulation. So you have not only the ability to accurately have, obtain absolute input from the system, but also regulate processes according to that and interpret the information in the right way. So we'll see that coming up again and again. Okay, let's address the word pain. Pain is the outcome. It's not the mechanism, it's the outcome. In a simple way, pain is, if you look at it at the very simplest level, and there's more complex levels to pain, as the presentation indicates, you're looking at first at the extent of injury, which could be translated in a way to how much pressure is applied to the nerves. So just remember that pain is the outcome. The outcome of what? Of several processes that lead at the end to the interpretation of pain. At the end of the day, or process, you might start with a certain level or value of pain, and for multiple reasons, which we will discuss in the presentation, the interpretation or the perception of pain changes. So as you can see, that we have special function, special senses dysfunction, such as vision, hearing, smelling, touch, and taste, which are the five senses, right? That we use for perception and interaction with the environment. And I want to emphasize the word environment here. You have to understand that we have a relationship with the environment in the body, or as a person, as a being. And changes in the environment are going to affect us and vice versa. So we are an open biological system that interacts in more than one way with the environment. We actually bring into our body molecules and components of the environment. And we are affected by the environment, by what we see, hence the vision, but from sounds, hence, hearing, from molecules that are in the air, smelling, by things that we touch, that we come in physical contact with, and things that we decide to taste, right? So it might seem very simple to you and basic, and that's a good thing always, if you think that something is basic, but we have a relationship here with the environment, and of course then you can have a number of combinations between senses. Okay, I'm going to jump straight to slide number 26. And I want to emphasize the third, something within the third point. Okay, slide number 26, the third point on the slide, and it says that the pain receptors are going to respond selectively to stimuli. And that means that they kind of decide, in a way, what to respond to and what not to. And if these are receptors of pain, that means that this can be very specific to every person. And while one person might not react to such pain in such an area of the body, the other might actually respond. So notice that, the word selectively. In addition, we see that the number and distribution within the body, and I'm relating to the first point in slide 27, is not the same in the body. So we have areas that are highly sensitive to pain and areas that are less sensitive to pain, and sometimes not at all. Then we have a very simple example, which I like very much, of how structure influences function. When we talk about structure and function, that is one of the basic principles of nature. And we see that the heavily myelinated fibers, in this case the alpha delta fibers, are very fast, because we talked about the myelin sheet, and the thicker or the heavier myelin, the faster the conductance of impulses in the nervous system, and vice versa. And then you can see other samples of fibers in the examples of fibers in the presentation, whereas when the myelin sheet is thin, conductance goes down. So if we're talking about adjusting the structure, in this case how thick or thin the myelin sheet is, to our needs of conducting information, obviously in places or in situations where we need the information to reach the brain and reach the organs from the brain faster, we're going to use the alpha delta fibers, and so on and so forth. Very simple principles of basic A&P. Now let's go to slide number 30, and I'm addressing the first point. The interpretation of pain is influenced by culture, interesting point, sex/gender, past life experiences, and current expectations. And it's amazing, if you ask me. This is very, very interesting, in my opinion. The culture you're raised in, that you were born into, is going to influence how your body interprets pain. Sex differences, okay, to some extent you might even expect differences almost automatically, not in every case in the body. Past life experiences, meaning this is something you can learn from. And current expectations, what you think is going to happen. Literally, pain is complex. It's not the sum of the injury. It's not just the extent of the damage. It's not just the location. It's about multiple factors that have to do with you as a person. So in theory, two persons with the same extent of damage, exactly the same, at the same location, happened the same way, the same time of day, will still interpret pain differently if they are from different sexes, if they are from different cultures, if they are of different life experiences and different expectations of the event. Of course, I have to be fair and accurate and say they may have a different interpretation of pain, just to be fair. Okay, so now in that very slide number 30, the second and third point together are very interesting in my opinion. The third point is talking about the location, the type, and the extent of pain. The last point is how you respond to it at the emotional level, or at the level where you're trying to avoid pain by behavior. So this is very interesting, and I think that the last few slides are talking about the idea that pain is a combination of behavioral responses and processes, both responses and processes, to differentiate between the two, and the actual biological aspect of things or medical aspect of things at the cellular / tissue / organ and systematic level. Okay, then we can talk about acute adaptation versus chronic, which is always going to come up when it comes to the body. We see that the acute adaptation and responses include learning. I'm talking about slide number 31, just to be sure. And the acute modulation of pain. And then we start talking about modulation in slide 31, and this is regarding a bit more, or pertaining a bit more to chronic modulation. So I think the first two slides are pretty simple to understand. I just want to emphasize in slide 33, for example, that when we're talking about the wind up phenomenon, we're talking about resetting or setting a new threshold, which is an important thing, meaning that the system is set to a new regulation point. Okay, that kind of resembles the idea of homeostasis and resetting or recalibrating the system. Notice that both slides 35 and 36 can be influenced chemically as the causes for the condition, and so the solution may be by drugs and chemical substances. Okay, you have different levels of explanations on how pain is conducted and perceived, and I want to jump to slide number 40 and emphasize a couple of points in that slide. I want to relate to the second point, which talks about somatic pain, which is superficial. You can see that it is at the level of the skin. It's well localized, it's sharp, dull, aching, or throbbing, but it's very superficial. And then we have the visceral pain, which is deeper, going into the cavities, going into the organs, and that makes it a bit less localized, meaning that at the level of the skin, the sensory effect is a bit increased or higher relatively to inner parts in this case. And then we can see how when the brain gets confused, you see that term or phrase on slide 42, but it also relates to what I'm talking about in slide 41. The brain is confused by multiple resources or inputs of information regarding pain. And then what happens is that it loses its ability to locate the origin of the problem. So pain is referred or felt far from the origin. Why? Because the interpretation as if the origin is perceived by the brain, which is confused. Once again, remember, it's confused, as if it's coming from the farthest part of the body, which is not, or of that pathway that is conducting the information to the brain, which is not necessarily the truth. But it's picking the far end because it's the easiest point to choose. Obviously, it can't be the closest part. That doesn't make sense. So you take the farthest part as your next logical point to start perceiving as if the pain is coming from there. And obviously, biologically, that means that you're including in the pain process as if it's occurring far away from where it is, and every organ and tissue in between. So that's the referred pain, or what's called radiated pain. Then you can see that you have certain terms for persistence pain and so on and so forth. And this is a good time to tell you that, of course, for the exam, you should know the definitions of different conditions, disorders, and diseases, and how would it play in a person. Okay, and if we're talking about slide 43, there's 2 points that I want to emphasize, or 2 ideas. It's in the second point, where we're talking about persistent pain being believed that the brain undergoes atrophy, meaning influencing its size, and then dysregulation. And regulation is one of the most important processes in the body. We see that it's related to stress. I want to remind you that we've learned about stress before, but if it's related to stress, then it might be reversible, because stress can be controlled. We see that if it's not treated, acute pain, it will become chronic pain, meaning that it is reversible in some cases, unless it's untreated or undetected in a way, and then it will become chronic pain. One of our problems, which is a completely behavioral / environmental issue, is that we tend to see these people with chronic pain as if they are chronic complainers. And we just want them to be quiet. We want them to stop complaining. No one likes a complainer, right? We see it as a behavioral thing only, as being weak or dependent, and we don't understand that this is a sign of chronic pain, and we can use these signs as clinicians to understand a greater problem. You can see in slide number 46 the words, in the last point, the words structure and function. Notice that the pain's pathways has changes to its structure and then to function, and structure and function and the relationship between the two is a major principle in nature. They come together, anatomy and physiology, and that's why you've learned about anatomy and physiology in A&P, and that's why the course is called that way. That's why it's taught together. Then we can see in slide 47 that chronic pain can be either central or peripheral, meaning can be induced or originate from either parts of the nervous system. Then we see central, so we have basically two neuropathic pains. One is going to be peripheral, originating from the peripheral areas of the body, and the second one will be central, okay, which obviously means that the source of the problem is in one of the major centers of the brain, spinal cord, or brain dysfunctions, as indicated in slide 48. Okay, I'm going to stop here, and we'll have multiple short videos to follow. So this is the end of part 1, and you'll have more parts, each one give or take half an hour.